Yo, what's up guys, welcome back to another video. This is a reaction to how the Korean DMZ works by Wendover Productions. This is a new video and this is obviously the border between North and South Korea. Very militarized border. A lot of stuff happens here, and I mean there's a lot of videos out there that sort of explain stuff to do with it, but I don't think I've ever done a reaction solely focused on the DMZ. And yeah, we're gonna see now. But let's just check this out and learn about what this really truly is, and like what they do here. And because obviously there's like a little meeting area, I think, where people from either side of either country will, I guess, talk and try and progress their the war that's going on, or the standstill, whatever it is. But yeah, we're gonna check this out. Links are also in the description to my Patreon, where you can see reactions I can't post to YouTube. But let's check this out and see how the DMZ works.
For 2 years, the two forces on the two sides of the Korean War fought bitterly and brutally to no end. They would each sacrifice supplies and lives to push the front mere miles in one direction or another, yet on July 27th, 1953, each side packed up and walked away from that same line. That's because, at 10 a.m. that day, the powers in charge sat down in Panmunjom and signed 18 copies of the Korean Armistice Treaty, which stipulated that, within 72 hours, the two sides would retreat 2 kilometers back from the mutually agreed upon demarcation line that roughly reflected the final state of the conflict. Still today, 70 years on, the two sides stand watch exactly where they finished their 2-kilometer walk back. The zone in the middle, now largely empty, is the notorious DMZ, the demilitarized zone. That name reflects the rules. Originally, only 1,000 personnel from each side were allowed within their half of the DMZ at a given time, and they were only allowed to carry small sidearms. These rules have drifted through time away from the letter of the armistice's law, but this is still one of the most high-stakes flashpoints globally, especially in 2024, so they still reflect their original intention: to prevent conflict. Each side needs to make it abundantly clear to the other at all moments that they have no intentions of a military incursion, and the best way of doing this is staying far, far away from the line. Therefore, the intention of the DMZ is to act as a 4-kilometer wide zone of nothing. Each side controls access to the zone itself with heavily fortified fences and walls, yet within the DMZ there is no wall separating the two Koreas.
Oh damn.
Some spots have signs, yet for most of the 160-mile, 250-kilometer stretch, North and South Korea are separated by nothing but an invisible line through the forest.
I would have assumed maybe there's like landmines and stuff like this. The fact that it is just open land, obviously getting over the fence in the first place is gonna be pretty much, I guess, near impossible. But that is like, the fact that it is so empty is, I mean, I wonder why.
These days, it's essentially the world's most heavily fortified wildlife sanctuary. With nothing the norm, it's therefore rather interesting when there is something. Starting from the west, the first sign of humanity is this: a road. This is rare. Even rarer is the electricity lines next to it, the water pipes beneath, and the railroad a few feet further on. This is by far the most modern linkage between the two Koreas, and it's one of just 2 to have border crossing checkpoints on each side, facilitating, at least theoretically, the movement of civilians from one side to the other. But these haven't been used in years. This is all a vestige of a more hopeful time. For a period, this road facilitated the movement of people and products between South Korea and the Kaesong Industrial Complex, a rare collaborative experiment. South Korean companies would set up factories in the area staffed by North Koreans. North Korea would get jobs and access to foreign currency. South Korea would get labor for prices typically seen on the other side of the continent, yet just an hour's drive from Seoul. At its peak, over 50,000 North Koreans worked in the area, overseen by almost 1,000 South Koreans who were some of the only ever to be permitted into the north, especially for anything but tourism. And to move products south, freight trains crossed the border every day for a period. But in 2016, amid rising tensions, relations broke down and the experiment was shuttered, seemingly for good. But the modern border crossing infrastructure still exists in a way unseen along the rest of the DMZ. Theoretically, this rail line could be used to start passenger service between Pyongyang and Seoul at a moment's notice. South Korea even has a passenger train station ready to go, including signs indicating the direction of Pyongyang and immigration facilities able to process cross-border passengers. But so far, no true passenger train has ever left Dorasan Station to the north, and it's looking less and less likely that that will ever happen.
Jesus.
The next landmark is by far the most notable one, the Joint Security Area. Few sites so small have such deep and winding history. It served as the location of tens of thousands of prisoner exchanges, of numerous deadly skirmishes between the two sides, of President Trump's famous few steps across the military demarcation line into North Korean territory, and most recently, it's where Private Travis
I didn't even know he was in North Korea. That's the first I've heard of that.
King fled across that same line into North Korean custody to escape disciplinary actions by the US military. The reason why the JSA forms so much history is that it's the sole site where the DMZ effectively shrinks and the two Koreas stand face to face across the demarcation line. And until the 70s, they were even closer. The original concept of the JSA was as a joint neutral territory within which personnel from each territory could move freely to facilitate meetings and communication. But perhaps unsurprisingly, in retrospect, the two sides struggled to coexist. This came to a head in 1976 when a group of American and South Korean soldiers ventured out into the zone to prune a tree blocking their view from an observation post. A group of North Korean soldiers eventually came and ordered them to stop, saying they were not permitted to cut down that tree, but eventually, and rather inexplicably, after the Southern Work Party refused, the North Korean soldiers picked up the axes being used for pruning and bludgeoned two of the American soldiers to death.
What?
In the wake of that incident, it was decided that they would start enforcing the military demarcation line even within the now misleadingly named Joint Security Area. North Korea quickly built a new bridge to the north of the existing shared one so they'd be able to drive into their portion of the JSA without passing through South Korean territory. Today, the only areas regularly shared by the two sides are the conference rooms on the line, within which individuals are allowed to move freely across the sides. Eastward of the Joint Security Area, the DMZ starts to take its more typical form. The few features within it are defense infrastructure like this military base and these roads, which never cross the line. Occasionally there are the remains of a tunnel dug by North Korea and discovered by South Korea, some of which have been converted into museums for South Korean tourists, others of which just destroyed. This pattern continues with remarkable regularity across the entire width of the country. Truly nothing across a 4-kilometer strip of land. The first of really anything since the JSA is this road, just feet from the eastern coast of Korea. Like its western counterpart, this too is a vestige of a more hopeful time. For a decade or so in the early 2000s, the Mount Kumgang region directly to the north operated as a rare, tiny test in reunification. First on cruises, then on buses, and then on trains, South Koreans were permitted to travel to a portion of this area. Some just for fun, others to join a reunification event where older South Koreans could meet North Korean family members cut off by the division of Korea. More than 1 million South Koreans passed through the region before 2008 when North Korean soldiers shot and killed a South Korean tourist who walked too far along the beach and strayed into a military-controlled area.
Jesus.
South Korea quickly closed off tourism to the area, and the region went from a bustling, comparatively cosmopolitan resort town to but a remote, rural corner of the underdeveloped country. Today, the previously unifying road and its adjacent railway are barricaded shut, then cut off again 2 kilometers back at the start of the DMZ. The aforementioned represents all significant pieces of infrastructure that actually cross the demarcation line. There's always the potential of secrets, as demonstrated by the now discovered tunnels, but as far as we know, that's it. Yet, all the way back on the western side of the DMZ, within view of the JSA, are 2 other notable exceptions to the DMZ's nothingness: the sister villages of Kijongdong and Daesongdong.
So they're in the DMZ zones. This is so fascinating to me. We're learning about the whole history of the area, and they're very close. I guess maybe they're... So obviously this is the South Korea side, where this is the meeting point that they have mentioned earlier, for like the military personnel. This is where Trump basically walked into North Korea, right? But you've got... So I guess maybe this is the town for here, and that's the town for here, maybe?
Kijongdong was the only North Korean village allowed to remain in the DMZ when it was initially set up. These days, however, South Korea suggests that it's largely a propaganda tool and is uninhabited by any real population. Supposedly, when viewed closely through a telescope, there are no interiors to the buildings, the lights turn on and off at regular intervals, and the only people seen are caretakers tasked with keeping the streets clean. The most iconic feature, of course, is the 525-foot, 160-meter flagpole, which, for a period, was the tallest in the world. built in response to South Korea's 325-foot or 100-meter flagpole in its village of Daeseongdong. Daeseongdong is South Korea's sole village in the DMZ, and it still functions far more like a real one, albeit with some major security restrictions. A mere 1,000 feet or 300 meters sit between the demarcation line and the village's closest buildings. Farmers regularly work the fields going all the way up to the line, and like anywhere, there's nothing physically stopping anyone from walking from South to North Korea or vice versa. Therefore, the villagers, all inhabitants prior to the war or their descendants, must have military escorts when walking into the fields in case of a North Korean incursion. In addition, there's a curfew, most recently set at 7 p.m., after which villagers are not allowed to leave their houses. Even to get into the village, they must go through extensive security checks, and their visitors must apply for permission 2 weeks in advance. It's an isolated, restrictive life, but South Korea views life in Daeseongdong as a form of national service. The residents are sacrificing their freedoms to keep the dream of reunification alive. Therefore, in exchange, village residents are exempted from the nation's mandatory military service and get some significant tax cuts. But not all of the northernmost South Korean residents are so lucky. Where the military demarcation line ends on the beach, it theoretically turns into the northern limit line, the maritime border between the two countries. And within just 2 miles or 3 kilometers of this invisible yet all-important line is the island of Yeongpyeong.
Oh, wow.
It's tiny, it's rugged, and it, along with these 4, helps comprise the 5 West Sea Islands. Ever so near to the northern limit line, Yeongpyeongdo serves as a home to a community of nearly 2,000 South Korean residents, a center of operations to a small but busy fishing economy, and for the broader world, an example of just how tenuous life is along the thin line between North and South Korea. Now, for a while after Korean military leadership agreed to the armistice and the accompanying northern limit line, the 5 West Sea Islands were of little consequence. Thus, for the better part of 2 decades, they sat beyond the scope of military interest or intervention from either North or South. Today, a quick tour of Yeongpyeong, walking by memorials and bombed-out buildings, would immediately illustrate that these times didn't last. While not particularly valuable from an economic standpoint, these 5 islands, for 50 years, have become a focal point for the two Koreas grappling over territorial sovereignty. This started in the 70s with the normalization of 12 nautical mile territorial waters for all countries around the globe, an extension from the previous norm of 3. Suddenly, it seemed, at least from a North Korean perspective, that they had the rights to the waters within which Yeongpyeong and the rest of the islands sat. And further bolstering their claim, while the 5 islands were designated as South Korean within the armistice, origins of the agreement to the exact dimensions of the northern limit line have been lost to time, while later American intelligence reports have concluded that the line has little legal basis in maritime law. The upshot is this: North Korea's alternate maritime boundary, the inter-Korean MDL, along with a massive uptick in violence along the west coast. Grappling over control of the waters, North Korean ships have sunk South Korean fishing vessels, South Korean patrol boats have chased and exchanged fire with North Korean ships, and maritime skirmishes have escalated to full-on battles in 1999, 2002, 2009, and 2010. While most of these outbreaks have stayed at sea, North Korea has gone so far as to also shell military and civilian installments along the western islands themselves.
Jesus,
That's why Yeongpyeong Island looks like this. It's why the beaches are braced with barbed wire and anti-land.
Bro, living here would not be fun, man. It looks very depressing, especially with then like the risks of actually living here in terms of North Korea doing whatever to cause a bit of chaos or whatever they're wanting to do.
Defenses, it's why commemorative tanks sit along the city's edge while active tanks encircle monuments and roam the waterside. It's why artillery dot the island's edge and bomb shelters intermix with municipal buildings within the town. Ultimately, such defenses understandably don't look so different from those built up along the southern edge of the DMZ, as violent flare-ups aren't unique to the maritime extension of the DMZ. In fact, whether scrolling a report to Congress on North Korean provocations or the pages long of border incidents between the two Koreas, maritime conflicts only comprise a small fraction of incidents. The DMZ was never meant to be permanent, and yet, as a de facto border between two countries now both recognized by the UN, it has had a remarkable staying power. Just look at any world map printed after the 1950s. As a line on the map, it hasn't gone anywhere, but on the ground, as a strip of land supposedly both non-violent and impassable, it has at times been rendered fragile, penetrable, and highly deadly. In 1956, for instance, just 3 years on from its signing, the US challenged the agreement to its core by signaling its intent to position nuclear weapons in South Korea. The year following, they did just that, directly overstepping what had been agreed to.
Oh, they literally had nuclear weapons facing North Korea. God damn, man.
In paragraph 13D, that no reinforcing weapons or ammunition will be brought into Korea during the armistice. Ultimately, the armistice remained, but the move tore down a core tenet and threatened the entire agreement. A decade later, the armistice's physical manifestation, the DMZ, nearly crumbled when a North Korean ambush killed 8 patrolling soldiers south of the line, marking the beginning of the 3-year-long DMZ conflict. The conflict would see more than 50 separate deadly outbreaks between North Korean forces, mostly infiltrators or would-be infiltrators, and Republic of Korea allies directly along or south of the DMZ. Ultimately, North Korea's effort to spark a southern uprising would sputter, but not long after 800 had died, mostly along an area supposedly demilitarized. Following the increased effort to secure the DMZ from the south during the conflict, the North worked to undermine the zone by going beneath it. Across the 70s, the South found 3 separate tunnels that extended into or beyond the DMZ. In 1990, they identified a 4th. All the while above ground, as tunneling and counter-tunneling efforts toiled to navigate and circumnavigate one another for decades, the odd shootout broke out, killing would-be intruders, patrollers, and successful infiltrators alike. Across all the skirmishes and efforts to undermine the DMZ, big and systematic or small and singular, there have been deaths along the way. A through line across much of these fatal skirmishes has been American involvement and American deaths. While far outnumbered by Korean deaths on either side of the DMZ, since the closure of America's 4th deadliest war by total casualties, American troops have been involved in the DMZ conflict in the 60s, along with the counter-tunneling efforts in the 70s. They've also been involved in the odd and violent outbreak, ranging from the infamous axe murder incident in 1976 to North Korea downing an army helicopter after it veered just north over the DMZ in 1994. This is because the armistice which has created the DMZ is not an agreement between the governments of South and North Korea, but an agreement between the 2 fighting parties. The agreement wasn't signed by South Korean officials, but American generals representing the United Nations Command, North Korean officials, and a representative of the Chinese People's Volunteer Army. While Americans served along the DMZ for decades, they've done so along with a host of soldiers from countless other nationalities because they aren't serving under an American flag, but a UN flag. Not until 1991 did the UN command hand over management of the DMZ to the Republic of Korea Army, and still to this day, it is the UN command responsible for the Military Armistice Commission, which negotiates, inspects, and works on longer-term management issues involving the DMZ. And as for determining the future of the DMZ and keeping track of what's developing along its northern edge, well, that too falls on a coordinated international effort that includes South Korea, but spans a host of nations and agencies. And today, that tenuous, imperfect peace appears at its greatest threat in decades. The foundational cause is North Korea's decades-long process of nuclear weapons development and buildup, yet even throughout that, there have been moments of relative stability. 2017 saw...
I thought it was starting to get a bit better. I mean, I'm not going to say I follow it closely, but I just I feel like I've done a reaction to a video maybe like a year ago of like how there's been advancements in terms of, I guess, peace between the countries.
Some of the worst relations between the US and South Korea and North Korea of the 21st century, as the DPRK picked up ICBM and nuclear testing, and in the wake of the death of American Otto Warmbier after 18 months in North Korean captivity. But these relations
he's the guy who took the, like, what was it, the poster, and then he got caught, and then they eventually let him back in the US, but they had poisoned him or whatever, and then he died when he was in the US. Something along the lines of that. Brutal.
Quick, hard pivot in 2018. North Korea indicated interest in sending athletes to that year's Winter Olympics in South Korea, and that prompted the first diplomatic talks between the two countries in years. Within a month, North Korean skiers and skaters were on the ground in Pyeongchang, and the games represented a largely successful bout of unity. A few months later, Kim Jong-un and Moon Jae-in convened for a largely successful summit at the JSA in April of that year, and that was followed up with a high-profile summit between Kim Jong-un and US President Trump in Singapore.
What a wild link-up.
the furthest Kim Jong-un had traveled from the DPRK in years, and the first time a leader of North Korea and the United States had met face to face. Incremental progress was made, with all sides extending small olive branches, but eventually, after another Trump meeting in Hanoi and a further one at the JSA, follow-on talks by diplomats in Stockholm broke down, and any potential of further progress was stunted by the start of the COVID pandemic and North Korea's subsequent complete shuttering of its borders. After some of the most insular years for one of the most insular countries, North Korean rhetoric took a concerning turn in early 2024. Kim Jong-un declared that the country's goal was no longer peaceful reunification with the South, and that he now considered South Korea their principal enemy.
What the
This
hell?
came just days after the North's provocative shelling of the contested waters around Yeonpyeong Island, and months after the closing of a dozen DPRK diplomatic missions around the world. An act experts believe signals its recent focus on deepening relations with China and Russia instead. These same experts believe Kim feels like the diplomatic process failed in 2018 and 2019, and that this has pushed him towards preparing for war. Of course, alarming rhetoric is a constant. North Korea has repeatedly threatened the destruction of its enemies throughout the last 70 years, but experts believe that the risk that they'll follow through on that threat is as real as ever. According to two of the world's top North Korea experts, Robert Carlin and Siegfried Hecker, Kim Jong-un has already decided to go to war, and the current period of escalated tests, rhetoric, and buildup simply represents the preparation for that. And the timing is right. Their enemies are focused on wars in Ukraine and Gaza, rising tensions around Taiwan, and a tumultuous US election. Strategically, there hasn't been a better time for North Korea to start military action in quite a long time. The coming months and years will therefore serve as a crucial stress test of the DMZ, the UNC, and the other systems that have kept conflict at bay for the past 70 years. The Korean War never technically ended. There was no peace treaty, and the entire rise of the South Korean state occurred within the span of this 70-year ceasefire. So it appears that the question of whether the current division of the Korean Peninsula can maintain indefinitely will likely get its clearest answer yet in the years to come.
Damn.
Following the globe's conflict.
Well, there we go. It's not looking great, which I guess some people won't be surprised, but yeah, I mean, the fact that he's just flat out said that they're our biggest enemies now is kind of scary. World's most heavily fortified wildlife sanctuary. 923, I was not ready for the dream making zone. Yeah, I saw that. I was in the school, right?
All of the North.
Damn. My friends are on duty at DMZ. Cold weather, random landmines, wild animals, mosquitoes makes their life hard. Jeez. Look forward to jet lag, hide and seek in the DMZ. Is that their second channel where they like go and hide and seek in random places? I think they do it in like big cities actually, don't they? Anyway, hopefully you enjoyed this reaction. This was an interesting look into this place where there's a lot of stuff going on. There's a lot of history there. And I assume it's going to be there for a much longer time, like years and years. There's no sign of this going anytime soon. But yeah, that's pretty much it. Let me know what your thoughts on this place, your thoughts on, I guess, the future of North and South Korea. And that's pretty much it. Until next time, peace.